So today's video is going to be another solved true crime case. Today we're going to be doing another Australian case. I always ask my channel members what kind of cases you guys want to see, and two of the most overwhelming comments on one of my last status updates was Australian cases and cases where the mental health system has failed, primarily the perpetrator. So I found this case that kind of meshes all of that into one story. So today we're going to be talking about the Cairns child killings, or the Child Massacre. But before we get into the story, I just want to thank our sponsor for making this video possible, NordVPN. NordVPN is my personal favorite virtual private network service. I've used them for years to stay safe on the internet. It works by giving you another IP address from another country, and you appear as though you are operating from that IP address. And this can act as a barrier between you and all your information and people that might be trying to access it or hack it. And you actually get to pick where in the world this new IP address comes from, which also comes with so many different benefits on top of internet safety. You can access the internet as if you are in the country that you choose. So I choose an American IP address a lot because I love watching American Netflix. A lot of the YouTube videos that I want to watch that are banned in the UK are always available in America. There's so many reasons to get a VPN, but safety is the most important, especially if you use like public Wi-Fi's, like restaurant Wi-Fi, trains, cafes. You never know how secure those networks are. You never know how safe you're going to be connecting to free Wi-Fi, just random free Wi-Fi that you know nothing about. It's kind of scary. So I always use NordVPN to protect me from those.
And NordVPN are very kindly offering you guys a huge discount off of a 2-year plan plus a bonus gift when you go through my link, which is nordvpn.com/Eleanor, and use the code Eleanor at checkout.
You're welcome for your discount, by the way. Thanks again to NordVPN for sponsoring this video. Now let's just get into the case. Before we do, I just want to give my usual disclaimer that I mean absolutely no disrespect to anyone that I talk about in this video. This video is for educational purposes, and everything that I'm about to say is just information that I have found on the internet and I'm compiling into one video. Just a couple of content warnings. This case does involve the murder of children, and it also involves very brief themes of sexual assault, sexual abuse. And of course, in this case, we will be talking a lot about the mental health system, being failed by the mental health system, different mental illnesses, possible self-harm, you know, all these different mental health kind of themes. So if any of that is triggering to you, please do click out of this video and look after yourself. I'm sure I'll see you with a different case sometime that's a little bit more suited to you, but for now, be kind to yourself, and I'll see you again later. So with all that being said, let's just jump into the case. So this case takes place in Cairns, which is in far north Queensland in Australia. Even more specifically, it was in the suburb of Manoora in Cairns. And Manoora has been described as just a very typical North Queensland suburb. It was very normal. There was nothing extraordinary about it. Just a normal place where normal people lived and normal things happened. But on December 19th, 2014, around 11 a.m, police received a very frantic phone call from a young man. 20-year-old Lewis Warrior was the eldest of 8 children. He was the only one old enough to move out and start his own life, but he would often come back to his mother's home to visit her and all of his younger siblings. And so that's exactly what he was doing on this morning. It was a Sunday morning. He was going to go there and see everyone. But when he arrived, he found one of the most traumatizing scenes. When he got there, his mother was standing out on the veranda. She was staggering around, and as he got closer, he realized that she was covered in blood. She had stab wounds all over her, all her clothes were just soaked in blood. She was moaning in pain, couldn't really get a word out. So he called the police. Police and paramedics arrived as quickly as they could, and they got his mother into an ambulance where she was checked over on her way to the hospital. And this woman was just covered in stab wounds. I think there were about 35 in total, all over her body, primarily to her neck, chest, very vulnerable areas. So as soon as Lewis's mother was taken to the hospital, police decided to go inside the house just to kind of establish context here, because this was a very surprising thing for Lewis and for police to find on a Sunday morning, just his mother covered in stab wounds. Something must have gone on inside that house. But when police entered the front door of this house, they had no idea the true extent of this situation, this was about to get 8 times more horrifying. They started walking through this house, and in almost every single room, there was at least one murdered child. There were 8 bodies found in this house in total. 8 murdered children, all equally as brutalized as Lewis's mother was. There were stab wounds all over them. They were covered in blood. The walls, the floors were covered in blood. All of these 8 children were pronounced dead at the scene. It seemed that the only survivor of this whole attack was Lewis's mother. And through talking to Lewis a little bit further, police were able to conclude that the woman that had been transported to hospital, his mother, her name was Raina Thaiday, and she was also the mother to 7 of those 8 children found dead in the house. Those were all Lewis's younger siblings, apart from one, which was actually her niece, so Lewis's cousin. They were all relatives, all 8 of these children. So of these 8 victims, 4 of them were girls and 4 of them were boys. Their names were Malili, Angelina, Shantae, Raiden, Azaria, Daniel, Rodney, and Patronella. They were between the ages of 14, and the youngest of these 8 victims was actually just 18 months old. A year and a half. Pretty much still a baby. And Lewis Warrior, the one that had discovered this scene, or at least discovered the first part of the scene, he actually had to be the one to go down to the morgue and identify all 7 of his younger siblings that had been murdered. They were still covered in blood. This must have been the most traumatizing thing. If seeing your mother in that state wasn't bad enough, he then had to see all of his 7 siblings like that, plus his cousin, and he compared it to a horror movie. He could see all these injuries on them, like their bodies had been covered up as much as they could be, but in order to identify them, he saw wounds on their neck and on their chest. All 8 of these children, all 8 of the victims, all shared one funeral. It took place in like a big convention centre and had over 4,000 people come to pay their respects, one of which was actually the Prime Minister of Australia at the time, Tony Abbott. It was especially heartbreaking, I mean, even personally for me, researching this case, just seeing all the different sized coffins. Some of them were just so small, like it's so heartbreaking to think about. So now police had the job of taping up this awful crime scene that took place in this house and getting to work solving this case. They knew that their biggest lead in this case was, of course, the only survivor, Raina Thaiday, the mother of most of these children, but because she was in such a bad way, she was so injured, the hospital didn't let police talk to her for a while. But they knew that she was going to be such a big piece in this puzzle because, I mean, she was the only witness. She probably witnessed the whole massacre of all these children, and she was probably attacked by the exact same person, so maybe she could describe this person. They knew that she was going to be a big help, but for a while they weren't allowed to speak to her. They just had to wait for her to be treated and get back in good physical health before they could interview her. So in the meantime, they felt that the next best thing was to interview 20-year-old Lewis Warrior. Because this seemed as though that family had been targeted specifically, it didn't look like they'd been robbed, it didn't look like there was any other motive than to just break in there and kill them all. So they wanted to ask Lewis if the family had any enemies or if he just knew anything from an inside perspective of who could want to do this to his mother and all of his siblings. But he said that he just had no idea. He had no idea who would want to do something like this to his family. He said that his mother was a lovely, caring woman. She was friendly. She didn't have any enemies. She was a great mother. That was like her biggest passion in life. Her kids were like her pride and joy. And all the kids were really well-mannered, really respectful. Like, they were not a troublesome family. If anything, they were quite the opposite. Raina was quite popular. She was very well liked. She used to host things at her house. She was known to be a really good cook. Everyone loved her cooking, so she would host dinner parties. She would make food for people and go and deliver it to their houses. Lewis just could not understand why anyone would want to do this to such a lovable woman. But he did mention one thing to police about maybe one potential suspect. He told them to look into a particular relative of theirs. This relative was an 18-year-old boy. He had a criminal past, and at the time of the massacre, he'd actually just gotten out of prison. So Lewis was a little bit, not that he majorly suspected him, but he thought maybe this was a robbery gone wrong. You know, this cousin of his, or relative of his even, was quite a dodgy guy. So if anyone, maybe look into him. So this message was sent back to the police station, and police over there started getting to work tracking down this relative. But in the meantime, police that were still at the scene decided to go up and down the street, questioning all the neighbours, asking if anyone saw or heard anything. And none of them did. None of them heard or saw anything suspicious anyway, but one of the neighbours did tell police that they'd seen Raina and a few of her kids out on the veranda the night before, or in the early hours of the morning, around 2 a.m. She said that Raina looked as though she was just tidying up and the kids were just kind of playing out on the veranda. It was a kind of weird time for this to be taking place, but nothing seemed amiss. It didn't seem like they were worried or anyone else was there. So this gave police a better idea of the timeline of the murder. They knew that it must have happened at some point on that Sunday morning because everything was fine at 2 a.m. And then the phone call from Lewis to the police was made at 11 a.m. So something happened between 2 and 11. So as all of these interviews were going on, police were still searching the inside of the house for anything, maybe weapons or any kind of clues, or even just an idea of how this attack took place. So for example, most of the children were actually found in their beds. They were murdered in their beds, so maybe they were murdered in their sleep, and maybe they were totally unsuspecting. Maybe this happened in the middle of the night. A few knives were actually found around the home. I don't know if they had blood on them or anything because they actually had to seal them up and then take them for testing to see if they were the murder weapon. So that's a couple of different possibilities. Maybe they were just knives that belonged to that household, or maybe the killer had washed off the knives only to leave them at the crime scene. Anyway, the knives were sent off for testing, analysing. They had to wait for results to come back on that. And as all of this was going on, so this was a very, very fast-paced case. Of course, police got the call at 11 a.m. that morning, but by the afternoon, that street where the house was, where the massacre took place, it was covered in reporters, different journalists' cars. Literally, it was like jammed. Not just reporters though, but just random people from cairns that were hearing about this, that just felt so touched by what they were hearing. People were coming down to leave flowers and teddy bears and little toy figurines for the kids. People were so touched by this because, well, obviously, it was 8 children that were just murdered for seemingly no reason, all in their own homes, and it was even 6 days before Christmas. This is a time that is meant to be joyous. You're meant to spend it with your family. And now this family had been completely torn apart. A few of these 8 children as well had different dads. So there were so many different families affected here. So many men left without their kids. So many grandparents left without grandchildren. Like, this was horrific. On so many different levels, so many generations were missing loved ones now. So people were bringing Christmas cards down for the family. There was even one little clip I saw of a news report where someone had brought down a little rabbit stuffed toy with a little Santa hat on its ear. And I just think even the fact that it was so close to Christmas makes it hit so much harder. The whole of Australia felt for those children that day. You know, people that had never even heard of the family were crying. They were trying to pay their respects in any way that they could. Meanwhile, back at the hospital, Raina Thaiday, the mother of this family, was being checked over and treated for her injuries, and like I said, she had a lot. She had a punctured lung, a lot of blood loss. So they're checking her over, and that was when doctors noticed something a little bit weird about her injuries. The angles at which she'd been stabbed didn't seem natural. You know, if this was a spur of the moment altercation and she'd just been like stabbed in the chest, it would have been from a different angle. The angle that the knife physically entered her body just wasn't right. It wasn't natural. Instead, it seemed as though a lot of these wounds could have been self-inflicted. Raina had stabbed herself 35 times. And this was a huge realization to make because this turned the whole case on its head. It gave it a whole new meaning. Up until this point, police had seen Raina as the only surviving victim of this massacre. But if her wounds were self-inflicted, then what does that mean for the case? Does that mean that she was the killer? And maybe she was just trying to inflict wounds on herself to make herself look like a victim, when really this is all just a cover-up for her own massacre. Doctors still weren't letting police in to interview her, but they tried to ask their own questions here and there as they were treating her, but they noticed that she seemed like she wasn't really there. Like, the things she was saying, it was like she was intoxicated. She was slurring her words. So they did a toxicology report on Raina, and it found that she had absolutely no alcohol, no drugs, no substances in her system whatsoever. She was fully sober. But either way, doctors quickly informed police that they'd made this discovery about her wounds. And police were so shocked to hear this, because now the mother of most of these victims was seeming like the suspect. So now, police decided to go back out to the neighbourhood and do those door-to-door inquiries again, but this time, obviously, from a different angle. Now they wanted to know more about Raina. They wanted to know more about her relationship with her kids. They wanted more context behind what kind of person she was, or how this family operated day to day. And all the neighbours told the police that, for the most part, like the whole time they'd known her, she'd just been such a dedicated, nurturing, loving, kind mother to her 7 children. And she was really good at being a mum as well. She raised her kids really well. They were all really polite, kind kids. She was proud of her family. But within the last couple of months, her neighbours had noticed a couple of changes in her. We'll come back to those changes in a little bit, but as for the actual day of the murder, the woman that lived behind Raina, so her house backed onto Raina's house, they were like backwards neighbours. That was an even more confusing way to explain it, wasn't it? Anyway, this neighbour whose house backed onto it, she said that normally she can hear noises in the house, like especially first thing on the morning when all the kids are waking up. But on that particular morning, that Sunday, she hadn't heard a single thing. The house had been silent on Sunday morning. Other neighbours, however, said that the night before, they heard a lot of shouting. You know, there was some kind of altercation, there was some kind of fight or an argument going on. And obviously that other neighbour then told the police that she'd seen Raina and the kids out on the veranda at 2 a.m. and everything seemed normal. So this was quite a weird sequence of events. To put the timeline together, there was an argument, and then everything was fine at 2 a.m. and they were just out on the veranda tidying up or whatever. And then the next morning, all the kids are found dead and it's completely silent at the house. It seemed, you know, like just a weird sequence of events. The argument happened and then everything was okay. But somehow this still ended up in an 8-child massacre. Police also heard reports from neighbours saying that on the day before the murders, so this is the Saturday evening, neighbours had heard Raina Thaiday out in the streets, just pacing up and down her own street, yelling at nothing. She was out there for hours, saying a whole load of different things, and she was addressing most of it to Papa God. And some of these statements were absolutely terrifying. Like, Raina was saying that she was the chosen one, and she had the power to kill or curse anyone. And one of the neighbours actually briefly heard her saying, "If you hurt my kids, I hurt them first. You stab my kids, I'll stab them first. If you kill my kids, I'll kill them first." From this information, psychologists have since concluded that it sounds like Raina Thaiday was in some kind of schizophrenic episode the night before the murders. And maybe it was during this episode that she committed the massacre herself. I mean, that would explain why she had so many injuries on herself as well. So police looked into it a little bit further and they found that Raina Thaiday had a very extensive history of different mental illnesses. However, her record showed that she'd never really gotten any kind of help for these illnesses. She was severely overlooked by the mental health care system in Australia. She'd been given no treatment, no counselling, no medication, absolutely nothing. And it was now looking as though those mental health issues that should have been cared for and looked at were now the reason for such a savage massacre. But it wasn't just mental health issues that Raina Thaiday was struggling with at this point in time. She was going through a lot of financial issues. I mean, she was a single mother to 7 kids that she lived with, but she also had another son. This was financial stress. It was emotional stress as well, trying to care for 7 kids in your household. One of them is as young as a year and a half. I mean, I can't imagine how stressful that is. She'd also been through a breakup pretty recently before this as well. The father of her most recent few children had left. And of course, now that meant she had less money, less help looking after the kids. It was a huge, huge change. She might have felt all these different feelings that you feel with a breakup as well, the heartbreak and the anxiety and being out there by yourself now. And there had been so many warning signs in the run-up to this event that were either missed or overlooked. For example, her whole outlook on life, her whole perspective completely changed in the months before the massacre. Raina's religious views were suddenly becoming very extreme and strict. She believed that she was the chosen one, like she was some kind of special prophet. She would travel from church to church and ask for advice and seek counsel and share her sins. Raina herself, pretty much all her life before this incident, had smoked marijuana, and quite a lot of it as well. She used to smoke like 20 joints a day. And about a month before the massacre, she decided to ban any and all recreational substances from her household. So that was alcohol, weed, any other kind of drug, literally anything and everything was banned. And this was a woman that so avidly used it her whole life. Since she was a teenager, she'd been smoking marijuana. And for her to have this sudden and complete switch in mindset towards it should have been something that was maybe looked into by her friends and family. You know, why did her mind change so suddenly and severely? Even in the days before the massacre, she had this sudden urge to cleanse her house and herself, and she felt like there were demons or something like that. So she was doing like an extreme clear out. She was getting rid of all of their stuff. That was probably what she was doing at 2 a.m. on the veranda, because she just kept like picking up kids' toys and just any and every belonging that she had, and she would just throw them out in the yard. She wouldn't take them to a tip, or she wouldn't donate them, she wouldn't sell them. She would just leave them out in the yard. And this was her cleansing her space, just getting rid of hers and all of her kids' belongings. So after hearing all of this from Raina's friends, family, neighbours, police were pretty sure that she was, you know, she was it. She was the murderer. She was their prime suspect. And they just had to wait for her treatment to be over to be able to talk to her. Finally, after a couple of weeks, the hospital gave her the all clear and police were allowed to arrest her then and there at the hospital and bring her to the police station. The first thing they did before they actually interviewed her, like questioned her, interrogated her, was they brought in a psychiatrist, because it was very clear that this woman had severe mental illness and was likely in an episode at the time of the murder. So this was a lot more complex than just sitting an evil, cold-hearted killer down and like interrogating them in a questioning room. This was not the same thing, and they had to go about it way more sensitively. So this psychiatrist came in and they were asking Raina about the night of the massacre, and they concluded that she was for sure in an episode, and she felt as though she was getting messages from God and from higher powers telling her that the world was going to end. And this was probably what was inspiring all these radical changes in the months running up to the massacre. She believed the world was ending, and so she wanted to make sure that her soul and her house and her children were as pure as they possibly could be, so that they would go to heaven when the world ended. And she said that that is why she killed all 7 of her children and her niece, because she was trying to save them from the end of the world. The actual trigger for the murders themselves, now I don't know how accurate this is. I don't know if this is just something that news outlets said before they got the official verdict back from the police and the court that she was in a schizophrenic episode. So I don't know if this is true, but a lot of the reports said that the trigger for the actual massacre was the fact that 2 of her daughters came home late. They came home past their curfew. They'd been out all day and they missed their last bus home, and so Raina was marching up and down the street trying to find them. She called the police and demanded that they go out and find her daughters. And I think that it was at this point, when she was waiting for her daughters to come home, that she was marching up and down the street chanting all these things about, you hurt my kids, I'll hurt them first. The daughters eventually came back off their own accord that night. I suppose they just found another way to get home, and it was very shortly after that that the massacre took place. Raina herself has said that her trigger that night to commit this massacre was when she got the signal from God. God was going to send down a dove, and when she heard that dove's call, that was her cue to kill all of her children and her niece and save them from the end of the world. Some sources say that she actually started the killings with the family's pet duck. She went out into the garden, slaughtered the duck, and then came back inside for the children. Not much is known about how she actually carried out this massacre, and because they are children, I probably wouldn't go into too much detail anyway, but it's believed that she just went from room to room to room, from child to child to child. Some rooms even had a couple of children in, and she was just frenzied, just stabbing them multiple times on all different parts of their body as well. Some of the kids would have like 14 stab wounds to the chest and 10 to the back, so either she was moving them or they were trying to get away. It's heartbreaking to think about. And even then, I said there were 14 to the front, 10 to the back. Each of these kids was stabbed approximately like 20 times each. This was brutal, frenzied, savage. This would have taken a lot of physical effort and energy from Raina, which again is another reason why they could confirm that she was in this schizophrenic episode, because the physical strength that she had was unnatural. So she went between each of the children, killed all of them first, and then she turned on herself. She said that the reason she attacked herself after that wasn't because she was trying to cover up the murder. She wasn't trying to make herself look like a victim at all. The reason she was doing it was because she was trying to commit suicide. Like I said, she had a punctured lung, and she explained that because she was actually trying to stab herself in the heart for what she'd done. She was trying to take her own life because she didn't like the fact that she'd taken 8 other lives. She said she knew that she would be hated for what she did. She knew she would be hated for murdering all 8 children, but she knew that it was something that she had to do. You know, her beliefs at that time, she knew she had to do it. Anyway, finally, about a week later, 37-year-old Raina Thaiday was released fully from the hospital and psychiatrists and all of that kind of health care, and she was released to the police, where she was charged with all 8 murders. On April 6th, 2017, so just over 2 years after the massacre actually took place, this case went to Brisbane's mental health court for a trial. And I'm sure you can imagine how this went. Raina's team very much said, look, we know what she did was awful, and she does show genuine remorse, but at the time of the massacre, she was in this episode. She was not in control of her actions. She was not responsible for what she did. They even told the court about how long Raina had been struggling with all these different mental health issues, all these illnesses, and she'd got no help from the system, no treatment, no psychiatric assessment, no medication. She'd just been so let down and overlooked by the system. Not only all of her mental health issues, but she'd also been a victim of domestic violence, sexual abuse, I think mainly from her partners or previous partners, and she tried to get help for that as well, but she was let down there. And ultimately, all of these letdowns, all the times that she was overlooked and unsupported, her team said that all of that is what led to this massacre. Had she just got some help maybe 10 years earlier when she was first showing signs of having schizophrenia, then maybe this would have been contained and controlled and she wouldn't have done this. But I mean, I know that is so easy to say in retrospect. I understand that nobody could have predicted that this was going to happen. Nobody could have looked at her as a patient 10 years ago and said, she's going to go on to murder 8 people if we don't look after her. Of course, how were professionals supposed to know that this was how this was going to end? But it is so disappointing to see someone get so let down by the mental health system and the justice system to the point where it comes to something like this. Her defense argued that Raina Thaiday had no previous criminal history, so it wasn't like she was just a troublesome person that was causing issues and like, you know, this was very clearly down to her mental illness. She wasn't the type to go out and be violent or murder anyone. They said that she was definitely in an episode when she committed these murders. If she was mentally coherent at the time, she wouldn't have done it. And so they said they understood that because she murdered 8 children, she needed to serve some kind of time, but they asked that that time not be in a prison, but rather in some kind of psychiatric unit where she could get proper care. And the jury came back with the verdict that Raina Thaiday could not be found criminally responsible for what she'd done because she was so mentally ill. And the judge actually decided to throw in her 2 cents, and this is a quote from her. It was probably that long history of using cannabis that caused the schizophrenia to develop. Like I said, Raina had been smoking like 20 joints a day since she was a young teenager. And there are studies that say that like excessive marijuana use can lead to things like psychosis and late onset of things like schizophrenia. So Raina Thaiday was sent to Brisbane Mental Health Facility, and there she will be detained for the foreseeable future, you know, until she is assessed and they say that she is no longer a danger to herself and others. She'll be there indefinitely, probably for the rest of her life, but at least she's getting the proper care there. I mean, staff have said that she is progressing quite slowly and she has had a couple of relapses. Most notably on the 2-year anniversary of the massacre, she relapsed really badly and she was threatening to kill other patients. She was saying that she was going to kill everyone in the psych ward. She had to be detained and cared for. But ultimately, I think she's doing well. She hasn't harmed anyone from what I know. Since this awful massacre took place inside that house, they decided that they physically did not want that building up in Manoora anymore. It was just too awful of a memory. So they decided to knock it all down, completely demolish it, and in its place they have built a memorial park with 8 different trees to represent each of the 8 different children. People go there to leave flowers for the kids, leave them toys. There's fences that are literally lined with like teddies stuck to the fences. At one point they did put a couple of swings in this park so that other kids could use it and kind of remember the kids in a very light, fun, playful way, but then they later decided that maybe that's not the vibe that they wanted for a memorial park, so they took them out and now it's literally just like a big green open space with these trees to go and pay your respects. Lewis Warrior, Raina's oldest son, the 20-year-old that went and found her on the veranda and found the scene on that day, he has since said that he forgives his mother for what she did. He says that people unfairly judge her. They don't think about what she's been through in her life, because she did. She went through so much. She was in so many abusive relationships, and the reason that was quite kind of brushed over in this case is because I know nothing about that. I couldn't find anything about that online. So details and stuff, I'm not in a place to give details when I don't know the details. So I do want to kind of stress to you that she had quite a traumatic life herself, and then all of these mental illnesses that were just kind of swept under the rug and not cared for. So he feels that she's unfairly judged. People don't look into her past and understand how it got to the point that it did. I mean, massacring 8 children, I don't think I could ever understand, but you can understand the fact that she was in a schizophrenic episode and she was found literally not criminally responsible by the courts. He says that it's been a real journey for him to be able to find this forgiveness because he blamed himself for a lot of it for quite a while. He felt like he should have been there to protect them, and if he was there to protect them, then none of this would have happened. He said that he used to get this recurring nightmare where all of his siblings would be hiding behind him and he's trying to look after them while his mother is running towards them, like trying to attack them, and he's just got to protect everyone. I can't imagine how horrifying that must be to have nightmares about your own mother trying to kill your own siblings and you're in between them both. Like, it just sounds awful. It sounds like such a traumatic and confusing thing for Lewis to have had to go through. He says that he will live the rest of his life in honor of his siblings. He wants to make them proud. He knows that they're looking down on him, smiling, watching him go through all of his life, and he says that he's gonna make them proud. But that is all I have for this video. Thank you so much for watching. As always, please keep it respectful in the comments. This is a case about 8 children and it is a very sensitive topic with all the mental health things that we talked about, so Keep your comments respectful. Do share your opinions, but do so respectfully, please.
Thanks again to NordVPN for sponsoring this video. Remember, they're offering you guys a huge discount off a 2-year plan plus a bonus gift when you sign up through my link, which is nordvpn.com/Eleanor, and use the code Eleanor at checkout.
Huge thank you to all of my channel members for helping me decide the cases that I cover, especially my tier 2 members whose names are all on screen right now. If you want to become a channel member, you can just click the join button on a desktop, or there'll be a link in the description of this video. But yeah, thank you so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed, please leave a thumbs up down below because that would really help me out. If you want to subscribe, there'll be a link to do so right here. If you want to subscribe to my second channel, there'll be a link to do so right here. And if you want to watch another true crime video, there'll be a playlist on screen right now. Bye!